Dear listeners, close your eyes for a moment, and let's drift back to a summer day in 1763. The air in the forests of Pennsylvania still smells of gunpowder and pine, but the sharp crack of musket fire has finally fallen silent. For 7 long years, the woods here echoed with the sounds of war, shouts of soldiers in red coats, the war cries of Native American warriors, the groans of the wounded. It was the French and Indian War, a brutal conflict that stretched from the Ohio Valley to the frozen shores of Quebec, and today, the fighting has ended. If you listen closely, you might hear the faint cheers of settlers as they realize they've survived. They're tired, hungry, and many have lost fathers, sons, and brothers. But they're also hopeful. The French flag, the fleur-de-lis, no longer flies over North America. In its place, the Union Jack waves, from Hudson Bay down to the Florida Keys. Britain has won, and for the colonists, that means a new chapter. Or so they think. Far away, across 3,000 miles of ocean, in London's dusty government buildings, a man named George Grenville sits at a desk covered in ledgers. He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which means he's in charge of the Empire's money, and right now, that money is in terrible shape. The war has cost Britain nearly £70 million. To put that in perspective, a skilled worker in those days might earn £10 a year. This debt is so huge, it feels like a mountain pressing down on the Empire. Grenville runs his finger over the numbers. The national debt has doubled. Just paying the interest on it eats up half the government's yearly income. And to make matters worse, there are 10,000 British soldiers still stationed in North America, costing another £300,000 every year. Someone has to pay for all this, he thinks. And his eyes drift west, across the Atlantic, to the colonies that Britain has just fought so hard to protect. They've benefited from our victory, he mutters. Surely they can help cover the cost. Back in America, the colonists are too busy celebrating to think about Grenville's ledgers. In Virginia, tobacco planters gather in smoky taverns, slapping each other on the back and talking about the rich lands in the Ohio Valley, lands they've dreamed of settling for years. Now that the French are gone, one says, draining his tankard of ale, those fields will be ours. Our sons will build farms there, and our families will thrive. In Pennsylvania, a farmer named Jacob stands in his field, squinting at the western horizon. His 2 oldest boys are already talking about carving out homesteads in the forests beyond the Appalachian Mountains. No more French soldiers to stop us, he tells his wife, wiping sweat from his brow. We'll finally have room to grow. In Boston, merchants in their counting houses calculate profits from new trade routes. Think of the furs from the Great Lakes, one says, tapping his quill against a map. And the timber we can send to Britain. This victory is going to make us rich. These colonists have fought alongside British soldiers. They've spent their savings to support the war, mortgaged their farms, and sent their sons to die. They believe the spoils of victory, land, trade, opportunity, belong to them as much as to any lord in London. Why wouldn't they? They've earned it. But then, in October of 1763, a piece of paper arrives from London that will change everything. It's called the Proclamation of 1763, and when the colonists read it, their joy turns to confusion, then anger. King George III has declared that no one can settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The very lands they fought to win are now off-limits, reserved for Native American tribes, many of whom had fought against the British. Veterans who expected land as a reward for their service are stunned. What was the point of fighting, then? A soldier named Thomas asks his friends in a Philadelphia tavern. I lost my brother for nothing? Land speculators, men who'd bought up huge tracts of western land, hoping to sell them for a profit, stare at their deeds, suddenly worthless. A wealthy Virginian named William Byrd throws his copy of the proclamation on the fire. "This is theft," he snarls. "The king has stolen our future." The proclamation line stretches like an invisible wall from Canada to Georgia, trapping the colonists between the mountains and the sea. It feels like a prison. In Williamsburg, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry reads the proclamation by candlelight. His hands shake with rage. "We fought to protect this empire," he writes in a letter to a friend, "and now the empire treats us like children, locking us in our rooms. How can they call this protection when they steal the very land we bled for?" In Boston, a man named Samuel Adams, short, fiery, with a talent for riling people up, sits in his shop, listening to the townsfolk complain. He nods, asks questions, and takes notes. Adams knows that anger, if tended carefully, can grow into something powerful. This isn't just about land, he tells a group of farmers. It's about whether Britain thinks we're equals, or subjects to be ordered around. Here's a question to think about, as we settle into this story. Why would a victory that should have brought the colonists and Britain closer together instead drive them apart? The answer lies in that invisible line drawn by the king. For the British, the proclamation made sense. They were exhausted by war and debt. They wanted to avoid more conflict with Native Americans, who had already attacked settlers in the Ohio Valley. But for the colonists, it felt like a betrayal. They saw it as proof that Britain didn't care about their dreams or their sacrifices. That summer day in 1763, when the guns fell silent, no one could have guessed that peace would plant the first seed of revolution. But as the colonists grumbled in taverns, wrote angry letters, and stared west at the forbidden mountains, that seed began to take root. It would take time, years of arguments, laws, and clashes, but the split between Britain and its American colonies had begun. The empire thought it was protecting its interests. The colonists thought they were fighting for their rights. And somewhere, in that gap between what Britain wanted and what the colonists needed, a revolution was waiting to be born. For now, though, the forests are quiet. The soldiers are going home. The settlers are still hopeful, even as their hopes are being quietly chipped away. But if you listen very carefully, you can hear the first rumblings of a storm, far off, but growing closer with each passing day. Let's step into a Boston shop in early 1765. The air smells of ink and paper, and a printer named James is hunched over his workbench, pressing a fresh sheet of newspaper. Outside, the streets are bustling, merchants hurrying to their counting houses, women carrying baskets of vegetables, children chasing each other past the town hall. But today, James isn't thinking about his next issue. He's staring at a notice nailed to the door. The British Parliament has passed a new law, the Stamp Act. Every piece of paper, he mutters, reading aloud, must have an official stamp. Newspapers, wills, deeds, even playing cards. And we have to pay for it, with British currency. He slams his fist on the bench. This isn't just a tax. This is a tax on living. Word spreads like wildfire. In New York, a merchant named Maria opens her ledger to record a shipment of cloth, and freezes. Every entry, every bill of sale, will now need a stamp. How can they do this? She asks her clerk. We don't send a single representative to Parliament. They're taxing us without asking. In Philadelphia, a lawyer named John sits in his office, surrounded by legal papers. Wills, contracts, land deeds, all of them will soon be worthless without a stamp. The Magna Carta, he tells his apprentice, says no free man should be taxed without his consent. That's been our right for 500 years. What makes Britain think they can ignore it? The Stamp Act isn't like the Sugar Act of 1764, which taxed molasses and mostly hurt merchants. This touches everyone. A farmer selling his land needs a stamped deed. A couple getting married needs a stamped license. A tavern keeper posting a notice needs a stamped sheet of paper. It's as if Britain is reaching into every pocket, every home, every part of daily life, and demanding payment for the simple act of existing. Here's a question to linger on: why did a tax on paper spark such fury? It wasn't just about the money. For the colonists, it was a test of their rights as British subjects. If Parliament could tax their paper, what couldn't they tax? And if they had no say in the matter, no representatives in London, were they really free? In Boston, Samuel Adams is already turning anger into action. He gathers a group of men in a tavern, their mugs clinking as they lean in to listen. "This isn't about stamps," he says, his voice low and intense. "It's about whether we're citizens or subjects. Let's show them we won't be pushed around." They call themselves the Sons of Liberty, a name meant to remind everyone what they're fighting for. Soon, Sons of Liberty groups spring up in every colony. In New York, they hang an effigy of the stamp distributor from a tree, called the Liberty Tree, drawing a crowd that cheers and shouts, "No taxation without representation." In Charleston, they parade through the streets with a coffin labeled Liberty, pretending to bury it, until someone revives it, and the crowd roars. These protests aren't just noisy, they're effective. Stamp distributors, scared by the anger, start quitting. "I won't risk my life for a stamp," one says, handing back his commission. By the time the Stamp Act is supposed to take effect in November 1765, there's no one left to sell the stamps. In October, something extraordinary happens. 9 colonies send delegates to New York for the Stamp Act Congress, the first time colonists from different provinces meet to coordinate their response. They draft a statement: "We are entitled to all the rights of British subjects," it says, "and those rights include not being taxed without our consent." They distinguish between taxes on trade, which they might accept, and taxes on their property and daily lives, which they won't. In London, Parliament is baffled. "They're British subjects," one lord argues. "We represent them virtually. Every member of Parliament speaks for the whole empire, not just their district." But Benjamin Franklin, who's in London representing Pennsylvania, scoffs. "Virtual representation," he says, "is like virtual food, it doesn't feed a hungry man." Merchants in Britain start complaining, too. The colonists have boycotted British goods, and warehouses are filling up with unsold cloth, tea, and tools. "Repeal the Stamp Act," they beg Parliament, "or we'll go bankrupt." By March 1766, Parliament gives in. The Stamp Act is repealed. Bells ring in Boston, cannons fire in Philadelphia, and people dance in the streets. "We did it!" James the printer shouts, waving a copy of his newspaper, now without a stamp. But the joy is short-lived. On the same day, Parliament passes the Declaratory Act, which says they have the right to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It's a quiet threat: we might back down now, but we're still in charge. Samuel Adams reads the Declaratory Act and shakes his head. This isn't over, he tells the Sons of Liberty. They've taken back the stamp, but they're keeping the power to tax us however they want. And sooner or later, they'll use it. He's right. The Stamp Act crisis taught the colonists something powerful: they could stand together and win. It taught Britain something, too. The colonists were willing to fight for their rights. And in that lesson, the next chapter of the story was already being written. As the summer of 1766 unfolds, the colonies return to normal, almost. Merchants sell British goods again, farmers plant their crops, and children play with unstamped playing cards. But beneath the calm, something has changed. The colonists have tasted unity. They've discovered their own strength. And they've learned that when Britain oversteps, they can push back. The seed planted by the proclamation of 1763 has sprouted. Watered by the Stamp Act, fed by anger and hope, it's growing into something neither side can control. And as the leaves unfurl, you can almost see the shape of what's coming, a revolution, not yet named, but already taking root in the hearts of men and women who've begun to wonder, what if we don't need Britain to tell us how to live? Imagine it's a crisp autumn morning in 1767. You're standing outside a general store in New York, watching as a merchant unloads crates from a ship. The air smells of salt and pine, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer rings through the streets. But today, the merchant's face is grim. He's opening a crate of glass panes, beautiful, clear, just what the town needs for its new schoolhouse. But when he sees the price tag, he groans. Another tax, he mutters. On glass. On paper. On paint. Even on tea. This is the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, Britain's new chancellor. After the Stamp Act fiasco, Parliament thought they'd found a smarter way to tax the colonies, tax imports instead of things made locally. They figured the colonists wouldn't mind as much. After all, these were external taxes, not internal ones like the stamp. But they were wrong. The taxes hit close to home. Glass for windows, so families could let light into their cottages. Paper for letters, so a mother in Boston could write to her son in Philadelphia. Paint to protect barns from the rain. Lead for roofs. And tea, sweet, comforting tea, the drink that brought neighbors together in the afternoon. These weren't luxuries. They were the stuff of daily life. A housewife named Elizabeth stands in her kitchen, stirring a pot of stew. She thinks about the tea tax. We drink tea to warm ourselves in winter, she tells her daughter. To celebrate a birth, to mourn a death. Now Britain wants us to pay for the privilege of being together. Her daughter, Mary, nods. The women at church are talking about it, she says. They say we should stop buying British tea. Drink sage instead, or mint from the garden. That's exactly what happens. The Sons of Liberty, still fired up from the Stamp Act fight, urge people to boycott British goods. Why buy their glass when our own artisans can make it, they ask. Why wear their cloth when we can spin our own? In Boston, merchants sign agreements promising not to import British goods. In Philadelphia, women form Daughters of Liberty groups, gathering in kitchens to spin yarn and weave cloth, proving that patriotism could be stitched into every thread. But here's a question to think about. Why did these new taxes make people angrier than the Stamp Act? Partly, it's because they touched everyone, every single day. But there's another reason. Townshend had a sneaky plan. The money from these taxes would pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. For years, colonies had controlled how much these officials were paid, which meant they could keep them in line. Now, with salaries coming straight from Britain, officials wouldn't have to listen to the colonists anymore. They're trying to buy our leaders, a farmer shouts at a town meeting. To make them forget who they work for. Tensions rise. British soldiers start patrolling the streets of Boston, trying to enforce the new laws. At first, it's just a handful of red coats, but soon there are thousands. They sleep in taverns, take jobs from local workers to earn extra money, and argue with townsfolk in the streets. They act like they own the place, a young apprentice complains, after a soldier shoves him out of the way. One cold March night in 1770, the tension boils over. A crowd gathers outside the customs house in Boston. Someone throws a snowball at a British sentry. Then another. The sentry calls for help, and 8 soldiers rush to his side. The crowd grows, boys, sailors, laborers, shouting insults, lobster backs. Go home. Someone yells, fire. And then, bang. No one is sure who said it, but the soldiers fire into the crowd. When the smoke clears, 5 people lie dead or dying. A sailor named James Caldwell. A ropemaker, Samuel Gray. A former slave, Crispus Attucks. A young apprentice, Samuel Maverick. And Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant who'd come to America for a better life. The town is shocked. Murder, people cry. The soldiers are killing us in our own streets. Samuel Adams, ever quick to turn tragedy into action, calls it the Boston Massacre. He has Paul Revere, a silversmith and artist, make a print of the scene, soldiers firing at unarmed civilians, their faces cruel and calm. It's not quite what happened, the crowd wasn't entirely innocent, and the soldiers were scared, but the print spreads across the colonies, stoking anger. Yet something surprising happens next. The soldiers are arrested and put on trial. And who defends them? John Adams, Samuel Adams' own cousin. We may hate what they did, John Adams says, but even soldiers deserve a fair trial. That's what makes us different from tyrants. He argues that the soldiers acted in self-defense, and most are acquitted. It's a brave move, and it reminds everyone that the colonists believe in justice, even for their enemies. In London, Parliament panics. They repeal most of the Townshend taxes, keeping only the one on tea. Surely this will calm them, they hope. And for a while, it seems to work. The boycotts ease. People start buying British goods again. It feels like peace. But the damage is done. The Boston Massacre becomes a story parents tell their children, a reminder of what happens when soldiers occupy a town. The Daughters of Liberty keep spinning their own cloth, proud of their independence. And the tax on tea? It lingers, like a splinter, small, but painful, a symbol of Britain's stubborn belief that it can tax the colonies however it wants. As the summer of 1770 turns to fall, Boston quiets down. The soldiers stay, but they keep to themselves. Children laugh in the streets again. Merchants unload their crates without muttering about taxes. But if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers, "We won't forget March 5th. We won't forget what they did." The seed of revolution, watered by anger and now blood, is growing stronger. It will be a few more years before it bursts into full bloom, but for anyone paying attention, the signs are clear. Britain and its American colonies are moving down separate paths, and soon, there will be no turning back. It's a cold December morning in 1773, and the harbor in Boston is choppy, the wind biting at your cheeks. 3 ships ride at anchor, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, their holds stuffed with a cargo that has set the town on edge, 342 chests of tea, enough to fill 18,000 cups. It's not just any tea. It's from the British East India Company, and thanks to a new law, it's cheaper than any tea the colonists have ever bought. But that's the problem. Let's backtrack a little. the East India Company was in trouble. Years of bad management and expensive wars in India had left it drowning in debt, with £17 million of unsold tea rotting in London warehouses. To save the company, Britain passed the Tea Act in 1773. It let the company sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the colonial merchants who'd always acted as middlemen. The tea would be so cheap, even with the Townshend tax still attached, that no one could resist buying it. Britain thought this was a clever solution. The company gets saved, colonists get cheap tea, and Parliament still collects its tax, proving once and for all that it had the right to tax the colonies. But the colonists saw it as a trick. They're trying to make us accept the tax by giving us a sweet deal. A merchant named John Hancock fumes in a Boston tavern. If we buy this tea, we're saying it's okay for them to tax us without asking. And what happens next? They'll tax our bread? Our firewood? The Daughters of Liberty, who'd been boycotting British tea for years, gather in a kitchen, stirring pots of sage and mint. "We don't need their tea," says Elizabeth, the housewife from earlier. "We have our own herbs, and our own pride." They pass around a petition: "No tea from the East India Company will enter our homes." When the 3 ships arrive in Boston, the town erupts. Mass meetings are held at the Old South Meeting House, with thousands cramming inside to debate what to do. "Send the tea back," some shout. "We'll pay for it, but it must go." But the British governor, Thomas Hutchinson, is stubborn. "The tea stays," he declares. "The tax will be paid, and the law will be enforced." For weeks, the standoff continues. The ships can't unload, but Hutchinson won't let them leave. The deadline looms: by December 16, if the tea isn't unloaded and the tax paid, customs officials will seize it and sell it at auction. That night, the meeting at Old South grows tense. "What more can we do?" a farmer asks. Samuel Adams stands up, his voice booming. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It's a signal." Outside, in the dark, a group of men, some dressed in rough coats, others with their faces blackened, a few even wearing feathers like Native Americans, gather near Griffin's Wharf. They're not there to steal the tea. They're there to destroy it. Imagine standing on the wharf that night. The air is cold, but you're sweating under your disguise. The ships are quiet, their crew asleep or too scared to interfere. You climb aboard, your boots thudding on the deck. With axes, you pry open the chests. The tea, dried, fragrant, crumbly, pours out like brown rain, spilling into the harbor. Plop, plop, plop. It floats on the water, a thick, frothy layer, as if the sea itself is brewing a giant pot. No one talks much. It's a serious business. You're not damaging the ships, not hurting anyone, not stealing a single leaf. This is a protest, not a riot. When you're done, you sweep the decks clean, as if nothing happened. Then you melt into the night, back to your homes, your shops, your families, hoping no one will recognize you. By morning, Boston Harbor smells like a giant teapot. The British are furious. Vandalism. Treason. Hutchinson writes to London, demanding punishment. But in Boston, people are quietly proud. "We stood up to them," a blacksmith says, wiping his hands on his apron. "We said, no tax without consent, and we meant it." Here's a question to ponder: why tea? Why did this particular cargo become the breaking point? It wasn't just about the tax. Tea was a daily ritual, a symbol of comfort and community. By taking control of the tea trade, Britain wasn't just taxing a drink, it was invading a part of colonial life. And by destroying the tea, the colonists weren't just wasting a commodity, they were defending their right to run their own lives. News spreads fast. In Philadelphia, people cheer when they hear. In Charleston, they unload the tea but lock it in a warehouse, letting it rot. In New York, they send the ships back to Britain. But in London, King George III and his ministers see only defiance. "This can't stand," the king says. "If we back down now, they'll think they can do whatever they want." So Britain strikes back with the coercive acts, soon called the Intolerable Acts, by the colonists. Boston Harbor is closed until the destroyed tea is paid for. The Massachusetts government is stripped of its powers, with officials now appointed by Britain. British soldiers accused of crimes can be sent back to England for trial, escaping colonial justice. And more troops are sent to Boston, turning the town into an occupied city. The Intolerable Acts do the opposite of what Britain wants. Instead of isolating Boston, they unite the colonies. "If Boston falls, we all fall," a Virginia planter says. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They don't call for independence, yet. But they agree to boycott all British goods, and they promise to support Massachusetts if Britain attacks. In Boston, the atmosphere is tense. Soldiers patrol the streets, their red coats a stark reminder of occupation. But there's a quiet resolve, too. "We won't be bullied," a teacher tells her students. "Not by taxes, not by soldiers, not by kings." As 1774 turns to 1775, the colonies are like a powder keg. The match? It could be anything: an argument between a soldier and a townsman, a ship loaded with more tea, an order from London that crosses the line. The Boston Tea Party didn't start the revolution, but it lit a fuse. By destroying that tea, the colonists showed they were willing to act, boldly, collectively, against what they saw as injustice. And by responding with harsh laws, Britain showed it was willing to fight to keep control. Somewhere, in the distance, you can hear the rumble of thunder. The storm is coming, and no one can stop it now. Picture Boston in the spring of 1774. The harbor, once bustling with ships, is silent. British warships block the entrance, their cannons pointing at the town like a threat. The docks are empty, the warehouses locked. This is the punishment for the tea destroyed months earlier, the Boston Port Act, part of what Britain calls the Coercive Acts, but what colonists are already calling the Intolerable Acts. "No ships in, no ships out," a fisherman named Thomas mutters, staring out at the warships. His boat sits idle on the beach, its nets rotting. How are we supposed to eat? To work? They're starving us. The Intolerable Acts are meant to crush Boston's spirit, but they do the opposite. News spreads to other colonies, carried by riders on horseback and printed in newspapers. In Philadelphia, a merchant reads the list of laws allowed to a crowd in the square. Boston Harbor will stay closed until the destroyed tea is paid for. Massachusetts government is stripped of power, no more town meetings without British permission, no more elected officials. British soldiers accused of crimes can be sent back to England for trial, so colonists can't punish them. And a new quartering act: colonists must house and feed British soldiers, even in private homes if needed. That's not just punishment for Boston, a farmer from New Jersey shouts. That's a warning to all of us. Today it's Boston, tomorrow, it's New York. Or Pennsylvania. Or Virginia. Here's a question to consider: Why did the intolerable acts unite the colonies instead of dividing them? Because they weren't just about tea anymore. They were about power. If Britain could close one colony's port, rewrite its laws, and force its people to house soldiers, then no colony was safe. "We're all Boston now," a letter from Virginia declares. Support pours in. New York sends food and money. Philadelphia sends blankets and medicine. South Carolina sends rice. Even in Georgia, where some are hesitant to anger Britain, people collect supplies. "They may be far away," a Georgian planter writes, "but their fight is our fight." In September 1774, something extraordinary happens. Delegates from 12 colonies, all except Georgia, which is still on the fence, gather in Philadelphia. They call themselves the First Continental Congress. Imagine walking into Carpenter's Hall, where they meet. The room is full of men in wigs and coats, arguing, debating, but also listening. There's Patrick Henry from Virginia, fiery and passionate. John Adams from Massachusetts, quiet but sharp. George Washington, tall and calm, listening more than he speaks. They don't agree on everything. Some want to beg Britain for peace. "Let's send a petition to the king," says John Dickinson from Pennsylvania. "Tell him we still want to be loyal subjects, just with our rights." Others, like Samuel Adams, are ready for more. "Loyalty won't save us," he argues. "Britain has shown it doesn't care about our rights. We need to stand together, or fall apart." After weeks of debate, they reach a compromise. They write a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, listing their complaints: the closing of Boston Harbor, the end of self-government in Massachusetts, the unfair taxes. "We are British subjects," it says, "but we demand the same rights as people in Britain, including no taxation without representation." They also agree to a continental association, a boycott of all British goods, from cloth to tea to tools. "If we stop buying their products," Adams explains, "British merchants will scream for peace." Money talks louder than petitions. To make sure everyone follows the boycott, they set up local committees, groups of ordinary people, from farmers to blacksmiths, who will check up on merchants and report anyone breaking the rules. In towns across the colonies, these committees become the heart of resistance. In Maryland, a committee confronts a merchant selling British cloth. "You signed the agreement," they remind him. He apologizes, takes the cloth off his shelves, and donates it to the poor. In North Carolina, women in a village gather to spin their own yarn, so they won't need British thread. "We're not just boycotting," one says. "We're building our own way of life." The king, George III, reads the Congress's petition and laughs. "They're rebels," he says. "They just don't want to obey the law." He orders more soldiers to be sent to America. As winter comes, Boston remains under siege. But the town isn't alone. Riders bring news of the Continental Association, of other colonies standing with them. "We're not forgotten," Thomas the fisherman says, as a cart from Connecticut arrives with flour and salt. In Philadelphia, the delegates go home, but they promise to meet again in May 1775, if Britain doesn't change its ways. "This is just the beginning," Washington tells a friend. "We've taken the first step together. Now we'll see if we have the courage to keep going." That winter, something shifts in the colonies. People start calling themselves Americans, instead of Virginians or Massachusetts men. They sing songs about unity, tell stories about the Congress, and talk not just of rights, but of freedom. The intolerable acts were supposed to break the colonists. Instead, they forged them into something new, a group of people who, for the first time, saw themselves as one. And as 1774 turns to 1775, everyone can feel it, the storm is coming, and this time, the colonies will face it together. The air in Massachusetts is still crisp in April 1775, with a chill that lingers from winter. Farmers are planting their crops, children are flying kites in the fields, and in Boston, British soldiers march through the streets, their red coats a sharp contrast to the green of spring. But beneath the calm, tension hums like a beehive disturbed. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, sits in his office, staring at a map. He's heard rumors, the colonists, called Minutemen, because they can fight at a minute's notice, are stockpiling weapons in Concord, a town west of Boston. And two of the most troublemaking patriots, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, are hiding in Lexington. If I can seize their weapons and capture those two, he thinks, I can stop this rebellion before it starts. On the night of April 18, 700 British soldiers slip out of Boston. They march silently, their boots crunching on the dirt roads, heading for Concord. But Gage didn't count on the colonists' watchfulness. In Boston, Paul Revere, a silversmith with a knack for trouble, sees the soldiers leave. He races to a church tower and hangs two lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea, a signal to patriots across the Charles River that the British are coming by boat. Then Revere mounts his horse and rides into the night. The regulars are coming, he shouts, galloping through villages like Charlestown, Medford, and Menotomy. Farmers wake up, grab their muskets, and rush to warn others. William Dawes, another rider, joins him, and later, a doctor named Samuel Prescott. Together, they spread the alarm, the British are marching to Concord. Arm yourselves. At dawn on April 19, the British reach Lexington. The town green is quiet, but suddenly, 70 Minutemen appear, led by Captain John Parker. They stand in a line, their muskets at the ready, facing the red coats. Stand your ground, Parker tells them. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. No one knows who fired first. Maybe a nervous British soldier. Maybe a Minuteman. But there's a crack, a gunshot that echoes across the green. Then chaos erupts. British soldiers fire a volley. When the smoke clears, 8 Minutemen are dead or dying. The rest scatter. The British cheer, thinking they've won. They march on to Concord, confident. But Concord isn't defenseless. The Minutemen have hidden most of their weapons, burying them in fields, hiding them in barns. When the British arrive, they find only a few crates of gunpowder and some cannonballs. Frustrated, they set fire to a few empty buildings. From a nearby hill, Minutemen watch the smoke rise. They're burning our town, someone shouts. 400 colonists rush down the hill, heading for North Bridge, where a small group of British soldiers is guarding the crossing. The soldiers fire a warning shot, wounding 2 Minutemen. Then the colonists fire back. 3 red coats fall dead. The rest flee. Now the British are in trouble. They've destroyed almost no weapons, and the countryside is rising against them. As they march back to Boston, Minutemen hide behind stone walls, trees, and barns, picking off soldiers with their muskets. It's like hunting deer, one farmer says, aiming carefully. The British are trapped in a deadly crossfire. Their uniforms make them easy targets, and they're exhausted from marching all night. By the time they reach Boston, 73 British soldiers are dead, 174 wounded. The colonists have lost 49 men. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. This is no longer a protest. This is war. News of Lexington and Concord spreads like wildfire. In New York, a merchant closes his shop and joins the militia. In Virginia, George Washington reads the reports and sighs. "The die is cast," he says. "We must fight." In Philadelphia, delegates to the Second Continental Congress, meeting just weeks later, vote to raise an army. They choose Washington to lead it. Here's a question to think about: why was that first shot in Lexington called "the shot heard round the world"? Because it wasn't just a battle between colonists and British soldiers. It was the start of something new, a fight for a country that didn't exist yet, a country where people would govern themselves. That idea, of a nation built on liberty, would inspire people around the globe for centuries to come. In the weeks after April 19th, thousands of Minutemen surround Boston, trapping the British Army inside. They set up camp on hills around the city, their tents dotting the landscape like a patchwork quilt. Farmers leave their fields, blacksmiths put down their hammers, and even some clergymen pick up muskets. "We're fighting for our homes," a young soldier writes to his mother. "For our children's future. I hope you'll understand." General Gage looks out from Boston and sees the enemy camped on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, just across the Charles River. If we take those hills, he thinks, we can break the siege. On June 17, 2,200 British soldiers charge up Breed's Hill. The Minutemen, low on gunpowder, wait until the redcoats are almost on top of them. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," someone shouts. Then they unleash a volley that cuts down the British ranks. The British charge again and again, and finally, the Minutemen run out of gunpowder. They retreat, but not before inflicting 1,000 casualties on the British. "What a costly victory," Gage mutters. "The colonists have lost 450 men, but they've proved they can stand up to the world's greatest army." As summer comes, the war is no longer a series of skirmishes. It's a full-blown conflict. George Washington arrives in Boston to take command of the new Continental Army. He's tall, calm, and determined, but even he knows the road ahead will be long. "We have much to learn," he tells his officers. "But we have something the British don't: we're fighting for our freedom." In homes across the colonies, families gather to talk. Should they support the rebellion? Or stay loyal to Britain? Some, called loyalists, fear the chaos of war. "Britain has protected us for years," they argue. "We owe them our loyalty." But others, the patriots, see no turning back. "We tried to talk to Britain," they say. "We sent petitions. They answered with bullets. Now we have no choice but to fight." The shot fired in Lexington that spring morning changed everything. It turned protests into a revolution, colonists into soldiers, and a dream of liberty into a fight for survival. As the leaves turn red and gold in the fall of 1775, one thing is clear: there will be no going back to the way things were. The United States of America doesn't exist yet, but it's being born, in the fields of Massachusetts, in the debates of Congress, and in the hearts of men and women who've decided they're ready to build a new kind of country. The summer of 1775 hangs heavy over Boston. The air smells of gunpowder and sweat, and the town is a pressure cooker, 4,000 British soldiers trapped inside by 15,000 colonial militia camped on the hills around them. The militia aren't an army, not really. They're farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, with muskets of all shapes and sizes, wearing whatever clothes they could grab when the alarm sounded. But they're determined. "We won't let the redcoats leave Boston," a young Minuteman named Tim writes to his sister. Not until they respect our rights. Inside the city, General Thomas Gage is running out of patience. His soldiers are cramped, supplies are low, and the colonists' campfires glow like a ring of enemies every night. We need to take those hills, he tells his officers. Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. If we hold them, we can control the harbor. We can break this siege. On June 16, 1,200 colonial militia slip across the Charles River under cover of darkness. They're supposed to fortify Bunker Hill, but they spot Breed's Hill, a lower, closer hill that's a better spot to defend, and start digging. By dawn, they've built a rough dirt wall, chest-high, with cannons pointing toward Boston. "Look at that," a British sailor shouts, pointing from his ship. Gage's jaw tightens. "Attack at once," he orders. Imagine standing on Breed's Hill that morning. You're a farmer from Massachusetts, your hands blistered from digging all night. Your musket is old, borrowed from a neighbor, and you've got only a handful of bullets. Below, British ships fire cannonballs that crash into the dirt wall, sending clods of earth flying. You duck, heart racing, but you don't run. "Stay strong," Captain William Prescott calls. "We've got the high ground. They have to come up to us." The British soldiers line up on the beach, red coats shining in the sun. Drummers beat a steady rhythm, and they march toward the hill, slow, steady, like a machine. "Hold your fire," Prescott shouts. The militia grip their muskets, fingers on triggers. The redcoats get closer, 100 yards, 80 yards, 60 yards. "Wait for it," someone mutters. "Wait until you see the whites of their eyes." That's the order that will be remembered forever. It's not just about saving bullets, though they're short on those. It's about making every shot count. When the British are 50 yards away, close enough to see the buttons on their coats, the fear in their eyes, Prescott yells, "Fire!" A wall of lead tears into the British ranks. Men fall, screaming. The line breaks. Survivors run back down the hill, tripping over bodies. "We did it!" Tim shouts, grinning. But the celebration is short. The British reform, reload, and charge again. This time, the militia fire earlier, but the redcoats keep coming. Bayonets glint, and for a moment, it's hand-to-hand combat, musket butts, fists, even stones. The militia fall back a little, but they hold. The British retreat again, bloodied and angry. General William Howe, leading the attack, is furious. "One more charge," he roars. They can't hold out forever. The third time, the British soldiers climb the hill, exhausted but determined. The militia fire once more, but this time, their gunpowder runs out. "Fix bayonets," Prescott shouts, but most militia don't have bayonets. They fight with whatever they can, sticks, axes, their bare hands. Finally, Prescott yells, "Retreat! Save yourselves!" The militia stumble back across the river, leaving the hill to the British. But the victory tastes like ash. The British have taken Breed's Hill, but they've lost 1,054 men, almost half their force. The militia lost 450, but they've proved something: farmers can fight, and the British army isn't unbeatable. A dear-bought victory, Howe admits. Another such, and we are undone. Here's a question to linger on: why was a defeat like Bunker Hill actually a kind of victory? Because it changed minds. Colonists who'd been on the fence saw that they could stand up to Britain's best soldiers. British leaders, meanwhile, realized this wouldn't be a quick war. And for the militia, it was a lesson in courage, and in the need for better organization. A few weeks later, a tall, quiet man rides into the colonial camp. It's George Washington, sent by the Continental Congress to take command. He looks at the militia, men in rags, with mismatched weapons, arguing over who should lead which company, and sighs. "We have a long way to go," he writes to his wife, Martha. But he also sees their spirit. These men are brave. With training, they can be an army. Washington sets to work. He orders drills, marching in lines, firing in unison, learning to follow orders. He begs Congress for gunpowder, uniforms, and food. A soldier can't fight on an empty stomach, he argues. He listens to the men, too, even the ones who've never been told, "Sir," in their lives. Respect goes both ways, he tells his officers. Not everyone is happy. Some militia want to go home to their farms. "I signed up to fight, not march in circles," a farmer grumbles. But slowly, something changes. The men start to look like soldiers. They learn to trust each other, to fight as a team. They call themselves the Continental Army. In Boston, the British watch and wait. They know Washington is building something dangerous. He's turning a mob into an army, Gage warns London. But there's little they can do, trapped in the city. As autumn comes, the Continental Army digs in. They build fortifications, practice firing cannons, and share stories around campfires. Tim, the young Minuteman, now wears a uniform, a little too big, but it's a uniform. "We're not just farmers anymore," he tells a new recruit. "We're Americans." Bunker Hill had been a baptism by fire. It hurt, men died, hills were lost, but it forged something strong. The colonists had learned that courage wasn't enough. They needed discipline, unity, and a leader to guide them. Washington was that leader, and the Continental Army was becoming that force. Across the colonies, people read about Bunker Hill and Washington's arrival. They send food, clothes, and even their sons to join the army. "This is our fight," a Virginia planter says, as he watches his oldest boy ride off to Boston. The war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But after Bunker Hill, after the birth of the Continental Army, something fundamental had shifted. The colonists weren't just resisting Britain anymore. They were fighting for a nation, and they were starting to believe they could win. The year is 1776, and spring has come to Philadelphia, but the air hums with more than the warmth of the sun. It crackles with tension, hope, and a question that hangs over the Second Continental Congress like a storm cloud: should we break free from Britain, for good? In the State House, delegates argue late into the night. Some, like John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, still cling to the idea of reconciliation. "We're British subjects," he insists, slamming his fist on the table. "If we declare independence, we'll be traitors. And what if we lose? The king will crush us." Others, like Samuel Adams, are tired of waiting. "We've tried petitions. We've tried protests. They answered with soldiers and cannons," he says, his voice rising. "Britain doesn't see us as equals. They see us as property. It's time to say enough." Outside, the city buzzes with the same debate. A blacksmith pounds his anvil, talking to a customer about the latest news from Boston. "They're saying the Congress might declare independence," the customer says. The blacksmith pauses, wipes his brow. "About time," he mutters. "We've been fighting for it since Lexington." A schoolteacher in her classroom asks her students, "What does it mean to be free?" A young girl raises her hand, "It means no one tells you what to do, except yourself." The teacher smiles. "That's part of it," she says. "But it also means taking care of each other. Freedom isn't just for one person, it's for everyone." By June, the mood shifts. News arrives that Britain has hired German soldiers, Hessians, to fight in America. "They're bringing foreigners to kill us," a delegate from Virginia says. "This isn't a family quarrel anymore. This is a war for our lives." On June 7, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stands up in Congress and makes a bold proposal: "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." The room falls silent. Then the debate erupts. For weeks, they argue about loyalty, about risk, about what kind of country they want to build. Finally, they agree to form a committee to write a document explaining their decision to the world. The committee chooses Thomas Jefferson, a young lawyer from Virginia, to draft it. Jefferson is quiet, but his pen is sharp. He locks himself in a small room with a desk, a quill, and a pot of ink, and writes for days. Imagine him there, sunlight streaming through the window, his brow furrowed. He thinks about the rights he believes all people should have, rights no king can take away. He writes of self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, that they have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments get their power from the people, not the other way around. He lists the colonists' grievances against King George III, taxes without consent, armies sent to control them, trade blocked. He has plundered our seas, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people, Jefferson writes. It's not just a list of complaints. It's a justification for revolution. When Jefferson finishes, he hands the draft to the committee. Benjamin Franklin, with his wise eyes and playful wit, suggests a few changes. "Let's make it stronger," he says, crossing out a line and rewriting it. John Adams, always direct, adds a sharp phrase about tyranny. Then they send it to Congress. For 3 more days, delegates debate every word. Southern delegates object to a part that criticizes slavery, so Jefferson removes it, a painful compromise. Others argue over how harsh to be toward the king. Finally, on July 4, 1776, they vote. 12 colonies say yes. New York abstains, but will later agree. John Hancock, the President of Congress, signs his name first, large and bold, so the king can read it without his glasses, he jokes. One by one, 55 delegates add their signatures. Some cry. Some pray. All know that by signing, they're risking their lives, their families, their fortunes. "We must all hang together," Franklin quips. "Otherwise, we shall all hang separately." Here's a question to wonder about as we think of that day: why did a piece of paper matter so much? It wasn't just words. It was a promise to build a country where people governed themselves, where rights weren't given by kings but by birth. It told the world that the colonies weren't just rebelling, they were creating something new. On July 8, the Declaration is read aloud in Philadelphia's Independence Square. A crowd gathers, breathless. When the reader finishes, there's a moment of silence. Then cheers erupt. Bells ring. Cannons fire. A man in the crowd lifts his hat and shouts, "God bless the United States of America." No one had used that name before, not really. But in that moment, it felt real. The news spreads like wildfire. In Boston, George Washington has the Declaration read to his troops. Listen well, he tells them. This is what we're fighting for. The soldiers cheer, some crying. A young private writes in his journal, "Today, I stopped being a colonist. Today, I became an American." In Virginia, a plantation owner reads the Declaration to his enslaved workers. "All men are created equal," he reads. One worker, a man named Moses, looks up. "Does that include us?" he asks quietly. The owner hesitates. "Someday," he says. It's a small moment, but it plants a seed, one that will take a long time to grow, but will never die. In London, King George III reads the Declaration and scoffs. "A silly piece of paper," he says. "They'll beg for forgiveness soon enough." But his ministers are worried. "This changes things," one says. "They're not just angry subjects anymore. They're a nation." As summer turns to fall, the Declaration travels across the Atlantic, to France, to Spain, to the Netherlands. People read it and wonder, could we do that? Could we govern ourselves? It's a dangerous idea, but a powerful one. The United States of America was still just an idea in 1776. Its army was small and poorly equipped. Its government was new and untested. But the Declaration of Independence gave that idea a soul. It said that people didn't have to accept the world as it was, that they could build something better, together. In Philadelphia, the delegates go home, but they carry the Declaration with them, not just the paper, but the belief that freedom is worth fighting for. "We have declared it," Adams writes to his wife, Abigail. "Now we must defend it." The war would get worse before it got better. There would be defeats, shortages, and hard winters. But whenever things seemed darkest, people would read the Declaration again. They'd remember the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and they'd keep fighting. For in that document, they'd found something stronger than cannons or armies, a belief in themselves. A belief that they could create a country where everyone mattered, where no one was above the law, and where freedom wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. That, more than anything, was the miracle of July 4, 1776. Not just a declaration of independence from Britain, but a declaration of dependence on each other, on the idea that together, they could build something extraordinary. The year 1777 dawns cold and uncertain. George Washington's Continental Army shivers in winter camps, short on blankets, gunpowder, and hope. The British, meanwhile, hatch a bold plan: split the colonies in two. If they can seize the Hudson River Valley, they'll cut New England off from the rest of the states, starving the rebellion into submission. Leading the northern prong of this attack is General John Burgoyne, a dashing British officer with a flair for drama. His troops, 7,000 strong, march south from Canada, decked out in red coats and brass buttons, dragging cannons and even a grand piano, for officers' parties. Burgoyne calls his campaign a picnic, but he's in for a surprise. Imagine the forests of upstate New York that summer. The trees tower like giants, their leaves blocking the sun. Burgoyne's army snakes through the wilderness, building roads as they go, slow, backbreaking work. Local farmers, angry at the redcoats tramping through their fields, flee into the woods. They drive off cattle, burn crops, and leave nothing but empty barns. Where's the food? Burgoyne growls. His men go hungry, their boots wearing thin. Worst of all, the colonists are watching. Militia companies, farmers with muskets, blacksmiths with axes, shadow the British column. They pick off stragglers, ambush supply wagons, and chop down trees to block the road. "It's like fighting ghosts," a British soldier complains. In July, Burgoyne captures Fort Ticonderoga, a key fortress on Lake Champlain. The victory makes him overconfident. "See? This is easy," he tells his officers. But the colonists aren't defeated, they're just retreating to fight another day. Further west, another British force under Colonel Barry Street Ledger gets stuck besieging Fort Stanwix. Local militia, led by Nicholas Herkimer, rushed to help. In a brutal battle at Oriskany, Herkimer is shot in the leg, but he props himself against a tree, smokes his pipe, and keeps giving orders until he dies. His men fight on, and when Benedict Arnold arrives with reinforcements, shouting lies about thousands more coming, St. Ledger's Indian allies panic and flee. The British retreat, leaving Burgoyne's army isolated. By August, Burgoyne is in trouble. His supplies are nearly gone. He sends 800 men to steal food from Bennington, Vermont, but they run into John Stark and his New Hampshire militia. "We'll beat them today or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight," Stark roars. The colonists crush the raiders, capturing hundreds and seizing their weapons. Burgoyne's face turns as red as his coat. "This is a disaster," he mutters. Meanwhile, the Continental Army in the north gets a new leader, Horatio Gates, a cautious man who prefers digging trenches to charging into battle. But he has help, Benedict Arnold, the same firebrand who rallied troops at Fort Stanwix. Arnold is reckless, brave, and brilliant at spotting weaknesses in the enemy line. "We need to hit them hard," he tells Gates. "Not just wait." On September 19, the two armies clash at Freeman's Farm. Arnold leads a wild charge, his horse shot out from under him, but he keeps fighting, sword in hand. Daniel Morgan's riflemen, sharpshooters from Virginia, pick off British officers from 300 yards. The Redcoats hold the field, but they lose 600 men. Burgoyne calls it a victory, but his men know better. 3 weeks later, on October 7, the colonists strike again at Bemis Heights. Arnold, furious at Gates for demoting him, rides into battle anyway, his boot full of blood from a wound. He leads a charge that smashes through the British lines, capturing a key redoubt. A bullet shatters his leg, but as he's carried off, he shouts, "Charge! Give them hell!" Burgoyne's army is shattered. He retreats to Saratoga, surrounded by 12,000 colonial troops. On October 17, 1777, he surrenders. The British band plays "The World Turned Upside Down" as 5,700 redcoats lay down their weapons. Here's a question to wrap your mind around: why was Saratoga the turning point of the war? It wasn't just that the colonists won a battle. It was what the victory did. For one thing, it proved to the world that the United States could beat Britain, a superpower. For another, it convinced France to join the war as an ally. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin has been trying to win French support for years. He dresses plainly, tells funny stories, and lets the French believe Americans are simple, honest folk fighting for freedom. When news of Saratoga arrives, Franklin smiles. Now, he says, they'll listen. In February 1778, France and the United States sign a treaty. French soldiers, ships, and gold will soon pour into America, changing the war forever. Back in the colonies, the victory at Saratoga sparks joy. In Boston, people dance in the streets. In Philadelphia, Congress declares a day of Thanksgiving. A soldier writes to his mother, "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. The whole world is watching, and now, they're on our side." Even George Washington, who'd been struggling with defeats in the South, feels a surge of hope. "This is the boost we needed," he tells his officers. "Now we can fight like we might actually win." But Saratoga also has a darker side. Benedict Arnold, the hero of the battle, feels overlooked and unappreciated. Gates takes all the credit, and Congress ignores Arnold's wounds. "I've given everything for this cause," he mutters. It's the start of a bitterness that will one day turn him into a traitor. For now, though, the mood is hopeful. The colonists have learned that patience, guerrilla tactics, and a little luck can beat the best army in the world. They've shown that their revolution isn't just a rebellion, it's a movement with the power to change history. As winter comes, the Continental Army marches to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to camp. The days will be cold, the nights longer, and food scarce. But this time, they march with their heads held high. They know that Saratoga wasn't the end of the war, but it was the moment they started to believe they could win it. The world had indeed turned upside down. A ragtag army of farmers and shopkeepers had defeated a British general and his invincible troops. And with France at their side, the United States of America was no longer just a dream. It was a nation with a fighting chance. The winter of 1777 to 1778 is one of the coldest anyone in Pennsylvania can remember. Snow piles high, burying roads and fields, and the wind howls through the trees like a wounded animal. In a valley called Valley Forge, 12 miles from Philadelphia, George Washington's Continental Army makes camp, and it is not a camp of comfort. Imagine rows of log huts, crudely built with mud chinking, huddled against the wind. Inside, 12,000 soldiers shiver, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Many have no coats, their shirts ragged and threadbare. Some wrap themselves in blankets stolen from farms, others wear hats made of straw or old sacks. Their feet are the worst, bloody, frostbitten, wrapped in rags or even leaves. "I have seen men with their toes frozen off," a doctor writes in his journal. Yet they still stand guard, because they believe in what we're fighting for. Food is scarce. The army's supply lines are broken, and local farmers, some loyal to Britain, others just scared, hide their grain. Soldiers eat fire cake, a tasteless mix of flour and water baked over coals. Sometimes there's a little beef, but it's often frozen solid, and they cook it in their hats because they have no pots. "We're starving," a young private from Massachusetts writes to his father. "But we're still here. We won't leave." Morale plummets. Men desert in the night, slipping away to find warmth and food. Others get sick, smallpox, pneumonia, typhoid, and die in crude hospitals, their bodies buried in shallow graves. Washington walks among them, his face grim but his voice steady. "These are the times that try men's souls," he tells them, quoting Thomas Paine's latest pamphlet. "But he who outlives this storm will see the sun again." Here's a question to ponder as we huddle with these soldiers: what kept them going when everything seemed lost? It wasn't just patriotism, though there was plenty of that. It was loyalty to each other, to the man shivering next to you, to the officer who shared his last crust of bread, to Washington, who rode through the snow without a coat to show he was one of them. It was the belief that their suffering meant something, that freedom was worth freezing for. Then, a spark of hope arrives in the form of a Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben. He's loud, eccentric, and speaks almost no English, but he knows how to turn a mob into an army. "You call this drilling?" he shouts, watching the soldiers stumble through formations. "I will make you into soldiers, American soldiers." Von Steuben starts with the basics. He teaches them to march in step, to fire their muskets in unison, to reload quickly. He drills them from dawn till dusk, shouting in broken English and French, but the men don't mind. For the first time, they feel like a real army, not just a bunch of farmers with guns. "He's tough," a sergeant says, "but he makes us proud." Women play their part, too. Martha Washington, the general's wife, arrives in February, bringing warm clothes and medicine. She organizes the other officers' wives to cook, sew, and nurse the sick. These men need more than food, she tells them. They need to feel like someone cares. Local women sneak into camp with baskets of bread and potatoes, risking punishment from British loyalists. "My son is out there," one says, nodding at the huts. "I'll do whatever it takes to bring him home." By spring, something remarkable has happened. The army is leaner, almost 2,500 men died that winter, but stronger. They march in formation, their uniforms, patched and mended, but, looking proud. They fire their cannons with precision, thanks to Henry Knox, who hauled them all the way from Fort Ticonderoga. "We're not the same army that came here," Washington writes. "We're better." And then, the news everyone has been waiting for: France has officially joined the war. It starts with rumors, a French ship spotted off the coast, a letter from Benjamin Franklin in Paris. Then, in May 1778, it's confirmed: French soldiers are coming, and French ships are sailing to block the British Navy. The camp erupts in cheers. "We're not alone anymore," a soldier yells, waving his hat. The first French troops arrive in July, led by the Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman who'd volunteered to fight for America. They're dressed in crisp white uniforms, with shiny buttons and polished muskets. At first, the Continental soldiers stare, they look so different, so professional. But then Lafayette steps forward, shakes Washington's hand, and says, "We are brothers now." The French bring more than soldiers. They bring guns, gunpowder, and gold to pay the troops. They bring warships to challenge Britain's control of the seas. Most of all, they bring hope. "If France believes in us," a private says, "we must be worth believing in." That summer, the army leaves Valley Forge, marching toward Philadelphia. The British, hearing of the French alliance, abandon the city. As the Continental Army marches in, people line the streets, cheering. A woman throws flowers, a child runs up to touch a soldier's uniform. "Look at them," she whispers. "They're ours." Valley Forge had been a test, a terrible, painful test, and the army had passed it. They'd learned that freedom isn't free, that it costs frostbitten toes and empty bellies and broken hearts. But they'd also learned that they could endure, that together, they were stronger than any hardship. With the French at their side, the tide of the war was turning. There would be more battles, more winters, more loss. But after Valley Forge, the soldiers knew one thing for sure: they would not quit. They would fight until victory, or until their last breath. As the sun sets over the valley that summer, the huts of Valley Forge stand empty, but their legacy lives on. They are a reminder that the hardest times often make us the strongest, that even in the darkest winter, spring is always possible. The year 1781 dawns with a weary kind of hope. The war has dragged on for 6 long years, and both sides are tired. British General Charles Cornwallis, a proud man with a reputation for stubbornness, has been chasing the Continental Army through the Carolinas, burning farms and clashing with partisan fighters like Francis Marion, the swamp fox, who melts into the marshes after every attack. "These rebels won't stand and fight like soldiers," Cornwallis grumbles. But he's growing desperate, his troops are exhausted, supplies are low, and the countryside is hostile. In June, Cornwallis marches his army into Virginia, hoping to find a port where the British Navy can resupply him. He chooses Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay, ringed by low bluffs and marshes. "Here we'll wait," he tells his men. "The Navy will come. We'll rest, then finish this war." What Cornwallis doesn't know is that two armies are already converging on him, like hunters closing in on a stag. In New York, George Washington has been planning a bold strike. For months, he's pretended to target the British Army in New York City, keeping their attention focused north. But his real goal is Yorktown. "If we can trap Cornwallis," he tells his officers, "we can end this war." To pull it off, Washington needs help from his French allies. The Marquis de Lafayette, the young French nobleman who's become like a son to Washington, is already in Virginia, shadowing Cornwallis with a small force. "Keep him pinned down," Washington writes. "We're coming." Then there's the French Navy, led by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse. Washington sends a desperate letter, "We need your ships to block the Chesapeake. No British reinforcements. No escape." De Grasse, sailing from the Caribbean, replies with a single word, "We." Imagine the summer of 1781 in Virginia. The air is thick with humidity, the fields green with tobacco and corn. Cornwallis's men dig trenches around Yorktown, building redoubts, small, fortified hills, with cannons pointing outward. They think they're safe. But in August, lookout spots sails on the horizon, not British ships, but French ones. De Grasse's fleet glides into the Chesapeake, 28 ships strong, blocking the bay. Cornwallis's face pales. "We're trapped," he says. By September, Washington and the French general, Comte de Rochambeau, marched their armies south, 6,000 Americans and 4,000 French soldiers, covering 400 miles in 15 days. Farmers along the way cheer, offering water and bread. "The general is coming," they shout. When they reach Yorktown, they join Lafayette's men, forming a ring around the town, 17,000 troops, a sea of blue and white uniforms, American, and white coats, French, stretching from the bay to the woods. Cornwallis looks out from his headquarters. "They can't take us," he insists. But his soldiers whisper. They've heard about Saratoga. They've seen the French cannons. The siege begins on October 9th, imagine standing in the trenches with the American soldiers. You can hear the French band playing La Marseillaise in the distance. Then, Washington gives the order, "Fire." Cannons roar. Balls crash into Yorktown's defenses, splintering wood and sending dirt flying. The British fire back, but their cannons are outnumbered. For weeks, the bombardment continues. Day and night, the sky lights up with flashes, and the ground shakes. Cornwallis's redoubts crumble. His men huddle in cellars, hungry and scared. "We're running out of ammunition," a British officer writes. And hope. On October 14th, Washington orders an attack on two key redoubts. One is taken by French soldiers, bayonets fixed, cheering as they climb the walls. The other is stormed by American troops led by Alexander Hamilton, Washington's bold young aide. "Charge!" Hamilton shouts, leading his men over the parapet. They fight hand to hand in the dark, but the redoubt falls. Cornwallis knows it's over. He tries to escape across the York River one night, but a storm scatters his boats. There's no way out, he admits. On October 17th, a British drummer boy marches through the lines, beating a parley. A white flag is raised over Yorktown. Here's a question to think about as the end nears: why was Yorktown the last? It wasn't just that Cornwallis surrendered. It was that Britain finally realized it couldn't win. The war was costing too much, and with France, Spain, and the Netherlands now fighting against them, the empire was stretched too thin. Yorktown didn't just end a battle, it ended Britain's will to fight. The surrender ceremony is on October 19, 1781. Cornwallis claims he's sick, so he sends General Charles O'Hara to hand over his sword. O'Hara tries to give it to Rochambeau, but the French general shakes his head, pointing to Washington. Washington, in turn, has his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, accept it, Lincoln, who'd been forced to surrender Charleston the year before. It's a quiet act of justice. The British soldiers march between lines of American and French troops, stacking their muskets. Their band plays a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting song for a day when a king's army surrenders to farmers and shopkeepers. In the American camp, there's no wild celebration, just a quiet, exhausted joy. A soldier from Massachusetts sits on a cannon, crying. "We did it," he says. Washington walks among his men, shaking hands, his eyes misting. "This is what we fought for," he says. News of Yorktown spreads slowly, carried by riders and ships. In Philadelphia, Congress erupts in cheers. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin raises a glass. "The United States is born," he says. In London, King George III paces his palace. "We must keep fighting," he insists, but his ministers disagree. "It's over," they tell him. For the soldiers, Yorktown means more than victory. It means going home. A Virginia private writes to his wife, "I'll see you soon. We're free now." A blacksmith from Pennsylvania thinks about his shop, gathering dust. "Time to build something," he says. But the war isn't officially over for 2 more years. There are still British troops in New York and Charleston. Negotiators in Paris argue over borders and trade. But in people's hearts, Yorktown is the end. It's the moment they know, the United States of America will survive. As winter comes, the armies disband. Washington goes to his farm in Mount Vernon, but he can't rest. "We've won the war," he writes, "but now we must win the peace. The hard work of building a nation is just beginning." Yorktown was more than a battle. It was a miracle, a moment when everything came together: American grit, French help, British mistakes, and a little luck. It proved that a group of colonies, united by an idea, could defeat the most powerful empire in the world. And as the sun sets over the York River that October, casting gold on the water, you can almost hear the future, the sound of children laughing in a free country, the clatter of workshops, the debates of a new government. It's a future won not just by cannons, but by courage, by unity, and by the belief that freedom is worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. The year 1783 dawns with the sweet smell of peace in the air. For 8 long years, the colonies, now the United States, have fought, suffered, and hoped. Now, in a grand building in Paris, 3 American diplomats sit across a table from British officials, putting pen to paper. The room is quiet, but outside, the world is changing. John Adams, blunt and stubborn, has traveled from the Netherlands, where he'd secured loans to keep the war going. Benjamin Franklin, 77 years old and wise, with his spectacles perched on his nose, has charmed the French court for years, winning their support. John Jay, sharp and strategic, has outmaneuvered British tricks to ensure America gets the best deal. Together, they've spent months negotiating, arguing over borders, fishing rights, and the fate of loyalists, colonists who'd stayed loyal to Britain. On September 3, 1783, they signed the Treaty of Paris. The words are simple but revolutionary. His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States to be free, sovereign, and independent states. Britain gives up all claim to territory between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River, from Canada to Florida. American fishermen can still fish off Newfoundland, a vital right for New England. And while the treaty asks states to treat loyalists fairly, it's a small price for what they've won. Imagine the moment the news reaches America. A ship docks in Boston, its captain shouting, "Peace! We're free!" Bells ring, so many bells that the air hums. People hug, cry, and dance in the streets. A mother in Philadelphia holds her son, who'd fought at Yorktown, and whispers, "You can come home now." A farmer in Virginia plants a tree in his yard, calling it the Liberty Tree. But peace brings its own challenges. The Continental Army, camped near New York, waits to be disbanded. Soldiers haven't been paid in months. "What about us?" they ask. "We fought for this country, will it forget us?" Some threaten to mutiny, but George Washington calms them. "Be patient," he says. "Your country will honor its promises." In December 1783, he rides to Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress meets, and resigns his commission. "I return to private life," he says, with a heart full of gratitude. It's a bold act, so bold that King George III calls him the greatest man in the world. Washington could have been a king, but he chooses to be a citizen. That's the kind of country America wants to be. As soldiers head home, they face empty pockets and uncertain futures. A blacksmith from Massachusetts finds his shop in ruins, looted by British troops. A former slave, who'd fought with the patriots in exchange for freedom, struggles to find work. Racism still casts a shadow. But they're free, and that means something. "I may be poor," one veteran says, "but no one can tell me what to do." That's worth more than gold. The new nation is a patchwork of 13 states, each with its own laws and currency. The government, under the Articles of Confederation, is weak: no president, no way to tax, no power to enforce laws. "We're more like 13 countries than one," a merchant complains, as he struggles to sell goods across state lines. States argue over borders, trade, and debt. In Massachusetts, farmers led by Daniel Shay's revolt when they can't pay their taxes. "Is this what we fought for?" they ask. Freedom without order? But the American spirit, born in taverns, battlefields, and town meetings, won't let the nation fail. In 1787, delegates from 12 states gather in Philadelphia to fix the government. George Washington presides, his presence calming fierce debates. James Madison, a quiet Virginian with a brilliant mind, drafts a new plan: a strong federal government with 3 branches, legislative, executive, judicial, to check each other's power. It's a delicate balance, but they call it the Constitution. Not everyone loves it. It gives too much power to the federal government, opponents cry. So Madison adds a Bill of Rights, 10 amendments protecting freedoms like speech, religion, and the right to bear arms. By 1789, enough states ratify the Constitution, and George Washington is elected the first president. On April 30, 1789, he takes the oath of office in New York City, his hand on a Bible. "I do solemnly swear," he says, "to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Here's a question to tuck into your heart as we end this story: what made the American Revolution truly revolutionary? It wasn't just winning independence from Britain. It was the idea that a country could be governed by, we the people, not a king, not a noble class, but ordinary men and women. It was the belief that all people are created equal, even if America didn't always live up to that promise right away. It was the courage to start over, to build something new, even when it was hard. As the 1790s unfold, the United States stumbles and grows. Farmers till the land west of the Appalachians, once forbidden by the proclamation of 1763. Merchants sail to China and India, trading American goods. Immigrants arrive, seeking the same freedom the colonists fought for. And in homes across the nation, parents tell their children stories, of Lexington, of Saratoga, of Yorktown, so they'll never forget the price of liberty. Benjamin Franklin, old and frail, watches the new government take shape. "I think we have a republic," he says, "if we can keep it. Keeping it won't be easy. There will be arguments, mistakes, and even a civil war decades later." But the seed planted in 1776, watered with blood, tears, and hope, grows into something strong. The American Revolution didn't end with the Treaty of Paris or Washington's inauguration. It's a story that continues, because freedom is never finished. It's in the hands of every generation, who must nurture it, fight for it, and pass it on. As you drift to sleep, imagine a summer day in 1783, in a small town somewhere in America. A child runs through a field, laughing. Her father, a veteran, watches, smiling. In the distance, a flag, red, white, and blue, waves in the wind. That flag represents more than a country. It represents a dream, that people can govern themselves, that rights are universal, that even the smallest voice matters. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well, knowing that the courage of those who came before us lives on, in the freedom we cherish, in the country we love, and in the quiet hope that tomorrow will be better than today.